Welcome to the history section. We're beginning our podcast today in March of 1503 at a moment of, well, extreme vulnerability for the Christian settlement at the Rio Veragua.
That's right. They've just completed the initial construction, maybe 10 or 12 houses.
And the immediate danger they're anticipating is flooding, which was typical for the region.
It was. But what's ironic is that the threat completely inverted. The research is quite clear that the heavy rains, which had allowed them to enter the river in the first place, just stopped.
And that lack of rain created a kind of environmental trap.
A devastating one. The river level dropped, and crucially, the mouth of the river, that sandbar separating them from the sea, and it just got choked with sand.
So what did that do to the depth?
It was catastrophic. They went from having 4 fathoms of depth, which is plenty for the ships, to just half a fathom.
Half a fathom. So the fleet is essentially immobilized.
So completely trapped inside the harbor. And there's another factor here, something that makes the whole situation even worse.
The condition of the ships themselves.
Exactly. The biological antagonist of this voyage, the shipworm.
The Teredo nivalis. Can you explain just how much of a threat this was? Why were they so afraid of even light waves?
Of course. After so many months in tropical waters, these ships weren't just worn out. The accounts say they were, and this is a quote, riddled through.
So the wood is compromised.
It's more than that. The shipworm burrows into the hull below the waterline until the planking is, well, it's essentially like a honeycomb. There's very little structural integrity left.
Plus, if a wave licks one of these ships and drops it on the sandbar,
it would just shatter. It would break apart. Their survival at this point hinges entirely on one thing: more rain. They need the river to swell and open that channel again.
They are, for all intents and purposes, hostages to the weather.
And it's while they're in this state, waiting, that they get some crucial intelligence from an interpreter.
About the local leader, Quibián.
Yes, and the information is serious. Quibián is deeply offended by this permanent Christian settlement on his land.
And he's planning an attack.
A decisive one. To burn the houses and kill every last Christian.
So with escape by sea impossible, the Admiral and the Adelantado realize they have to act first.
A preemptive strike is their only option. They can't just sit there and wait to be attacked. The goal wasn't just defense. It was, to establish dominance.
So what was the plan?
To capture Quibián, to teach him a lesson, as the records put it, and to secure him and his top men as political assets. The idea was to ship them back to Castile.
A mission that fell to the Adelantado.
It did. He set out on March 30th, 1503, with 70 armed men. A significant force for that kind of environment.
And Quibián was aware of their approach.
Oh, absolutely. He was positioned on a hill above the river. He sent a message trying to delay the meeting.
Claiming he was wounded.
Wounded by an arrow, yes. He said he couldn't meet indoors and suggested the Adelantado come to him outside, but alone.
Without the other Christians seeing him.
He claimed it was due to Indigenous jealousy, but it was a pretty transparent attempt to isolate the Adelantado.
A stalling tactic.
A classic one. But the Adelantado was too experienced for that. He proceeded, but very carefully. He took only 5 men with him.
Arranged in staggered pairs.
Exactly, keeping a discreet distance, while the rest of the 70-man force remained hidden.
So this careful approach paid off.
It did. The Adelantado went into the hut where Quibián was waiting. He pretended to be concerned, asked about this supposed arrow wound.
And while they were sitting down to talk,
he grabbed Quibián by the arm. That was the signal.
The ambush was sprung.
The other 4 men rushed in. Some accounts say they fired their muskets into the air and the main force converged on the village. They captured around 50 people.
Quibián, his wives, his children, his principal men.
And all without any injury to the local population, which is quite remarkable.
And what's really telling is what happened next. The captives offered a ransom.
A significant one. A great treasure hidden nearby, they said, in exchange for their freedom.
A direct offer of wealth, which the Adelantado refused.
He refused it outright. And that decision really highlights the priority. This wasn't about gold, not in that moment. It was about long-term security.
Quibián and his men were military assets, hostages.
Whose removal was seen as essential for the survival of the settlement. That's why the plan was always to send them to Castile.
Now, the chief pilot, Juan Sanchez de Cadiz, was given the task of transporting the cacique to the fleet.
And he was given a very severe warning from the Adelantado about the importance of keeping him secure.
A warning he apparently didn't heed.
No. The failure that followed was down to, well, negligence and a moment of misplaced pity.
What happened?
Halfway to the fleet, Quibián started complaining about his bonds, that they were too tight, that they were hurting him.
And Sanchez believed him.
It seems so. Out of some momentary sympathy, he untied the ropes. He kept hold of Quibián, but only by his hand.
A fatal mistake.
A single moment of distraction. Maybe he was looking away, thinking about something else. And that was the window Quibián needed.
He jumped overboard.
He jumped. And because Sanchez was only holding his hand, the jolt was enough to break his grip. Quibián was still tied to the boat by a rope, but he somehow managed to get free and swim ashore.
And the other prisoners?
They kept completely silent. They were afraid that if they raised the alarm, they'd be punished for the escape.
So Quibián just vanished.
Like a stone in water, is how the account puts it. They didn't even realize he was gone for a while. The next day, April 1st, the Adelantado gave up the chase. The terrain was too dense, too hostile.
And he returned to the fleet with the captured gold.
Yes, about 300 ducats worth. Mirrors, eagles, twisted cords. After the royal fifth was taken out, the 20% for the crown, the rest was divided up. But the real prize, the political leverage, was gone.
And just as that crisis ends, another one begins. The weather finally turned.
The rains came. The river swelled, raising the water over the sandbar. This was the chance the Admiral had been waiting for to get to Hispaniola for aid.
But getting the ships out was still dangerous.
Extremely. They had to lighten the ships, remove ballast. Even then, they scraped their keels crossing the bar. The Admiral anchored offshore, waiting for the sea to calm down enough for the crossing.
And it's during this incredibly delicate moment, with the Admiral offshore and unable to return, that Quibián's men attack.
The timing was perfect. The flagship's boat had just gone ashore for some last-minute supplies.
And the attack was swift.
Very. They snuck up to within 50 feet of the huts and then charged, yelling, throwing darts.
But the garrison responded.
The Adelantado, despite the surprise, charged out with 7 or 8 men. They managed to push them back into the forest, but only temporarily.
And there were casualties.
1 Christian killed, 7 wounded. The Adelantado himself took a dart to the chest.
And all this is happening while the captain of the flagship's boat, Diego Tristan, is just anchored nearby.
Yes, and his conduct proved to be catastrophic. The men ashore were yelling at him to help, to join the fight, but he refused. He claimed he was under strict orders from the Admiral. His only job was to get fresh water. He argued that if he lost the boat in a fight, it would sever the only link between the garrison and the Admiral's fleet.
So instead of helping,
he rowed upstream, deeper into the narrow, heavily foliaged river, looking for water. It was a profound strategic error.
He gave up every tactical advantage they had.
He did. The dense foliage along the banks was perfect cover. It allowed the indigenous fighters to emerge in their canoes and surround his boat.
They were ambushed.
Completely. The attacks started with loud cries, the sound of horns. The canoes were fast, light, armed with spears tipped with fish bones, which were lethal at close range.
And Tristan's men couldn't defend themselves.
The oarsmen had to drop their oars to pick up their shields, so the boat was just a sitting duck. They were hemmed in, overwhelmed.
Tristan was killed.
A spear through his eye. The accounts say every single man on that boat died.
Except one.
Except one. Juan de Noya, a cooper from Seville. He managed to dive overboard and swim underwater through all the chaos. He made it back to the settlement with the news of the massacre.
And the Admiral, offshore, could only watch the bodies float downstream.
An evil omen, he called it. For the men left ashore, seeing Quibián's retaliation, it was the final straw. They resolved to leave immediately.
In a mutinous fashion.
Yes. The only thing that stopped them from trying to cross the dangerous bar was the heavy sea. The Admiral was isolated, without a boat, watching this disaster unfold.
Which brings us to the next turning point, the escape of the remaining indigenous captives.
Aboard the Bermuda, yes. They were being held below deck, and in a moment of incredible carelessness, the sailors had used stones to hold the hatch cover down instead of chains.
An opportunity the captives didn't miss.
They piled up ballast stones to stand on, and then all together they forced the hatch open with their shoulders. Several of them jumped overboard and swam to freedom before the guards could react.
But the ones left behind.
The sailors managed to get the hatch chained shut, trapping the rest. And those captives, seeing their situation as hopeless, took their own lives.
A mass suicide.
They used ropes to hang themselves from the deck beams. The headroom was so low they had to bend their knees to achieve it. It was a horrific discovery the next morning.
And this act completely erased the Spanish advantage of holding hostages.
It made Quibián even more of a threat. And ashore, the garrison was on the verge of open mutiny.
Which is where Pedro de Ledesma comes in.
Ledesma, a pilot from Seville, a truly heroic act. He volunteered to swim across the sandbar, through the breaking waves, to find out what was happening.
And he found the garrison in open revolt.
They were refusing to stay. They were ready to risk drowning in their one small boat and 2 canoes rather than face the indigenous fighters. They weren't listening to the Adelantado at all.
So Ledesma swam back with this terrible news.
And the admiral, realizing the situation was untenable, waited 8 days for the weather to break. When it did, he organized the evacuation.
Using the boat and the 2 canoes.
They lashed the canoes together for stability and ferried everyone across the bar. They abandoned the settlement, they abandoned the worm-eaten hulk of the Gallega, and they got everyone aboard the 3 remaining ships.
Now, with everyone finally aboard, a strategic dispute breaks out.
It does. The pilots all assumed they'd sail north along the coast to Hispaniola for repairs. But the admiral made a different and very unpopular decision.
He chose to sail directly for Spain.
Yes. He knew the ships were in terrible condition, just riddled with shipworm, and he didn't think they could survive the strong westward currents between the mainland and Hispaniola. It was an immense risk.
A risk that almost immediately proved how bad things were.
At Portobello, they had to abandon another ship, the Vizcaína. It was just taking on too much water. The shipworm damage was too severe.
So now they're down to 2 ships.
The Bermuda and the Admiral's flagship. And they are kept afloat only by constant, exhausting work, 3 pumps going day and night.
And then a storm hits.
A bad one. The Bermuda is heavily damaged, her stern and stem shattered. At that point, it becomes clear that reaching Hispaniola is absolutely impossible.
So they turn for the nearest land, Jamaica.
They made it to a harbor called Puerto Buena, but there was no fresh water, no local population, so they moved east the next day to Santa Gloria, what's now St. Anne's Bay.
And there, the voyage ends.
Yes. They ran the last 2 ships aground, as close to shore as they could, propped them up with timbers, and built fortified cabins on the decks. They turned the wrecks into a fortress. This was the beginning of their year-long marooning.
And a new phase of survival. How did they establish relations with the local population?
Initially, it was surprisingly peaceful. The indigenous people were described as kind and gentle. They came in their canoes to trade provisions for Spanish wares.
And this trade was their lifeline.
Absolutely vital. The admiral, showing some real foresight, put 2 men in charge of all trade to ensure everything was divided equally.
Why was that so important?
It prevented the desperate men from scattering and committing outrages, which would have destroyed the trade relationship they needed to survive.
So what were they trading?
Small things, novelties, lace points, beads, little mirrors, red caps, scissors, things that kept the local leaders happy and the food coming.
But this couldn't last forever. They needed rescue.
Building a new ship was out of the question. They didn't have the tools or the time. The only option was to send for help.
A message to Hispaniola.
In 2 small indigenous canoes, an incredibly dangerous voyage. For this, the admiral chose his chief clerk, Diego Méndez, and a Genoese gentleman, Bartolomeo Fiesti.
And each canoe had 6 Christians and 10 indigenous paddlers.
Yes, along with food and water. The Adelantado escorted them to the eastern tip of the island to protect them from any local attacks before they set off into the open sea in July 1503.
And for 6 months, there was nothing.
Nothing, which led directly to the Great Mutiny in January of 1504.
What was the cause?
The conditions. The men were getting sick from the diet, just hutia and cassava bread. They were confined. And despair set in. Rumors started to fly.
That the admiral had no intention of saving them.
Exactly. That he was banished by the crown and that the canoe mission was just a ploy to save himself.
And this conspiracy was led by the Porras brothers.
Francisco and Diego de Porras. They leveraged the known political enmity between the admiral and Governor Ovando in Hispaniola, convincing 48 men that they would be welcomed as heroes if they escaped the admiral's supposed tyranny.
And the mutiny itself.
It was January 2nd. Captain Porras, armed, just walked into the admiral's cabin and confronted him. "Why are you keeping us here to perish?"
The admiral, who was suffering terribly from gout, tried to reason with him.
He suggested a council. Porras refused. He just yelled, "I'm for Castile, who's with me?" And the armed mutineers took over the ships.
They seized 10 canoes that were tied alongside.
They did. They left the admiral with only 20 loyal men, most of them sick, and then they attempted the crossing to Hispaniola.
An attempt that failed.
Twice. The canoes were overloaded. The winds were against them. In desperation, they started throwing everything overboard. First, their food and possessions.
And
And then they made a horrific choice. To lighten the canoes further, they decided to kill the indigenous paddlers.
It's a truly brutal account.
They began hacking at the hands of those clinging to the sides of the canoes. They killed 18 people in cold blood, saving just a few to steer them back to Jamaica.
So the mutineers were now also stranded, living as outlaws on the island.
Yes, robbing the local population to survive. Meanwhile, the Admiral faced a new crisis.
The food supply.
It started to dwindle again. The indigenous population grew wary of the Christians' enormous appetite. They started bringing less and less food. Starvation was a real possibility.
And this is when the Admiral used his knowledge of astronomy.
He remembered a total lunar eclipse was due in 3 days. He summoned the local leaders and told them the Christian God was angry with them for starving his people.
And he promised them a sign
of God's wrath, that the moon would rise inflamed, bringing famine and pestilence.
And the eclipse happened right on schedule.
To the absolute terror of the indigenous population. They came running to the ships, howling, begging the Admiral to intercede with his God.
You let them wait.
He retired to his cabin until the eclipse reached its maximum phase. Then he came out and announced that God had pardoned them, on the condition that they keep the Christians well supplied.
And it worked.
It worked perfectly. From then on, they were diligently supplied with food.
But still no rescue. 8 months passed with no word from Méndez.
And then a small caravel appeared. It was sent by Governor Ovando.
Rescue finally.
Not exactly. The captain, Diego de Escobar, delivered a barrel of wine, some salt pork, and a letter from Méndez confirming he'd made it.
And then
he left the same night without taking a single person off the island.
So what was that about?
It was a political move. The consensus is that Ovando, who was the Admiral's enemy, sent the ship merely to spy on him, to see if he was still alive, and to delay his rescue for as long as possible.
The letter from Méndez must have explained what happened.
It did. It described a harrowing journey. Extreme thirst, men dying after drinking salt water.
Until they spotted land.
Navassa, a tiny island 8 leagues from Hispaniola. The rising moon revealed it. They found water, rested, and then pushed on to Hispaniola, arriving on the 4th day.
But Ovando delayed him.
For months, Méndez finally had to go to Santo Domingo and buy and provision a caravel himself with the Admiral's money to send for the rescue.
And when news of this rescue finally reached the mutineers, the Admiral offered them a pardon.
A general pardon, which Porras and his lieutenants rejected.
What were their demands?
Half the space on any rescue ship, and they threatened to seize the vessels by force. Porras even told his men the caravel they saw was a phantom, an illusion conjured by the Admiral's magic.
So he came to a battle.
The Adelantado led the loyal men to meet the mutineers. The battle was short and decisive. Several of the mutineers were killed, including Juan Sanchez de Cadiz, the pilot who let Quibián escape.
And Porras was captured.
He was. The rest fled. The most incredible story from that fight, though, is about Pedro de Ledesma.
The pilot who swam the bar at Belén.
The same one. He fell over a clar and was found by some indigenous people who, testing their swords, inflicted the most horrific wounds on him. His head was cut open to the brain, his shoulder nearly severed. The surgeon swore he couldn't survive.
But he did.
He made a full recovery. It's an astonishing testament to his resilience.
And after the battle, the rest of the mutineers surrendered.
They pleaded for pardon, which the Admiral granted, though he kept Porras a prisoner.
And then, finally, rescue arrived.
1 full year after they were marooned, they set sail on June 28, 1504. The trip back to Santo Domingo was difficult against the currents.
And what was the reception from Governor Ovando?
Hospitable on the surface, but he immediately released Captain Porras from his chains, a clear political move against the Admiral.
And from there, back to Spain.
They sailed for Castile on September 12, 1504. They endured another terrible storm that split the mainmast, which the Adelantado ingeniously repaired.
They arrived back to find Queen Isabella had died.
A huge blow to the Admiral. King Ferdinand's reception was cold. While he formally confirmed the Admiral's rights, history shows he begrudged him his share in power.
The Admiral, sick with gout and exhausted by his ordeal, died not long after.
Today, we're looking at the final chapter of Christopher Columbus's life, and it's really a story in 3 parts. His debilitating illness, his relentless legal war with the Spanish crown, and then this incredibly strange multi-century journey of his actual remains.
That's right. And to really understand his death in 1506, you have to look at the medical history. The last decade of his life was, by all accounts, one of immense physical suffering.
What were the specifics of that?
Well, medical historians now are pretty certain he was suffering from a severe form of reactive arthritis. Most likely something called Reiter's syndrome.
Reactive arthritis, that's usually triggered by an infection of some kind, isn't it?
Exactly. And the leading theory is that he contracted a serious bout of food poisoning on one of his transatlantic voyages. The autoimmune response that followed just ravaged his body.
So by the time he died, what was his physical state?
The accounts describe him as being frequently bedridden. He had inflamed, bleeding eyes and had very, very limited movement in his limbs. He was almost paralyzed.
A terrible fate for an explorer. So what was the final cause of death?
The chronic inflammation and the stress on his body, it all points to congestive heart failure. It was brought on by this long-term rheumatic disease.
And where did he actually die? It wasn't in some grand palace, was it?
No, not at all. He was in a rented house in Valladolid. His death was a quiet affair, really. He was surrounded by his sons, Diego and Ferdinand, and just a handful of loyal crewmen.
And history tells us his last words were quite simple.
They were. He reportedly said, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit."
Now, beyond the physical pain, there was this cognitive issue, this absolute insistence he had until the very end.
Yes, his geography. He died fully believing, or at least stating, that the lands he had reached were the eastern coast of Asia, the Indies.
Which seems incredible to us now, but there was a very practical, a very legal reason for that, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a geographical error. It was a calculated legal position. His original contracts with the Spanish crown, the Capitulaciones de Santa Fe, were very specific.
They granted him titles and governorship over the Indies.
Exactly. And crucially, 10% of all revenue from those lands. If he admitted he'd found a new world, a mundus novus, that contract would be worthless.
Because it fell outside the scope of the agreement?
Precisely. The crown could have just said, "Our deal was about Asia. This is something else entirely." Admitting the truth would have stripped him of his titles and his claims to any wealth. His delusion was a legal defense.
And that legal fight really defined his last years. This brings us to the pleitos colombinos.
The Colombian lawsuits. A massive, decades-long legal battle between his family and the state, and he was at the center of it in his final years.
It all started after his time as governor of Hispaniola, which was a complete disaster.
A complete disaster. He was arrested for tyranny, for gross incompetence, and was actually sent back to Spain in chains in 1500.
A huge humiliation.
Absolutely. And while the king freed him, his political power was gone for good. The crown saw its chance to, walk back some of those incredibly generous promises they'd made.
So how did he try to fight back?
He basically became a petitioner. He spent his last few years, often too sick to walk, just following the royal court as it moved from city to city across Spain.
Just constantly demanding they restore his titles and that 10% cut.
Constantly. But King Ferdinand was, well, he was very skilled at ignoring him politely. He'd make vague promises, but he had no intention of giving that power or that money back to Columbus.
So he died with none of it resolved.
He died completely embroiled in a legal battle that his sons would have to continue for decades. But the fight over what was his, ironically, continued with his own body.
Yes, this posthumous journey is just extraordinary. It starts simply enough in Spain.
Right. After his death in Valladolid in 1506, he was first buried in a local friary there.
A temporary arrangement.
Very temporary. 3 years later, in 1509, his son Diego had to move to a more prominent monastery in Seville. But the real goal was always something else.
His wish was to be buried in the New World.
And that wish was finally granted. In 1537, his remains were exhumed, put on a ship, and sent across the Atlantic to the Cathedral of Santa Maria la Menor in Santo Domingo,
In Hispaniola.
the heart of the Spanish Empire at the time. And for about 250 years, that was that. He was finally at rest in the lands he'd claimed.
Until European politics got in the way.
Until 1795, yes. Spain ceded Hispaniola to France, and the Spanish authorities were determined that the French would not get their hands on the remains of Columbus.
So they staged a sort of preemptive evacuation of his bones.
They did. They dug them up and moved them to Havana, Cuba, which was still a Spanish stronghold. And there they stayed for another century.
Until the next major conflict, the Spanish-American War.
In 1898, right, Spain loses Cuba. And once again, it's the same fear. They couldn't let his remains fall into the hands of another power, this time the United States.
So it's another journey across the Atlantic, but this time back to Spain.
Back to where it all began, in a way. They were brought to the Cathedral of Seville, where they are today.
And the tomb there is?
Yeah.
It's quite something.
It's massive. A huge sarcophagus held up by 4 large statues that represent the 4 historical kingdoms of Spain. It's a very dramatic final statement.
But the story isn't that clean. A discovery in the 1800s throws a wrench in the whole thing.
It really does. In 1877, back in Santo Domingo, Workers in that same cathedral were doing some repairs and found a lead box.
And inside?
Inside were bones, and the box was inscribed with Christopher Columbus's name.
So the Dominicans immediately made a counterclaim.
Their argument was simple. In that frantic rush back in 1795, the Spanish took the wrong body. They probably took his son, Diego, who was buried nearby, and left the real Columbus behind.
Which brings us to the modern day, with two countries claiming to have the authentic remains.
Exactly. And this is where science comes in. In 2006, Spanish researchers took a small sample from the bones in Seville to conduct DNA testing.
And who did they compare it to?
They compared it to the confirmed remains of Columbus's brother, Diego. The lineage there was undisputed.
What were the results?
The DNA was a match. The bones in Seville are genetically related to his brother, so they definitely belong to a Columbus.
But that doesn't completely disprove the Dominican claim, does it?
It doesn't, and that's the crucial point. The Dominican Republic has, for years, refused to allow the bones in their cathedral to be tested.
So we can't get a definitive scientific answer.
We can't. And what this leaves us with is a very real possibility that over all those exhumations and transfers, the skeleton was simply separated.
So fragments of Columbus could be in both Seville and Santo Domingo.
It's entirely plausible. Both nations could, in fact, be custodians of a part of his physical history, a body divided between the old world and the new.
There's such a profound irony there. A man who died obsessed with his legal claims to territory and titles. And now, 5 centuries later, his own physical body is the territory being claimed and contested across 2 continents.
The great claimant is now the one being claimed. Very fitting postscript to a contentious legacy.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
Well, this is an AI recording. The research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.